Here. Thank you all for waiting. Hello. Hello, everyone. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Can everyone hear me decently well? We switched up our mic, so we should be able to, should get some better volume on this one. All right. Okay. If you can hear me, just type something in the question and answer box. That way. Okay. Hey, Angie. Let's see. All right, cool. Last time we had decent audio, but I was listening to it and there were a couple of muffled spots. So thank you so much for all of your patience and just bearing with all of our absolute madness this month. I've been really, really excited about this workshop and it's been undescribably crazy over here. Over Thanksgiving, well, before Thanksgiving, I shattered a wisdom tooth and I ignored it because I'm a busy person and it wasn't bothering me. And the thing that we've learned the very hard way this month is if you shatter a wisdom tooth, you need to go deal with it and not ignore it. And that ultimately turned into like a severe infection and sepsis. And I wound up having to have four teeth pulled. And so I have a really cute little gap and I look like a first grader again. And my kids think it's really funny. But I've had 3 rounds of surgery and it's been wild, but I'm starting to perk up. Our team is coming back to health and everyone's sort of getting in motion here. I think we have about 90% of everyone's supplies delivered, and the remaining few we're getting sorted out over the weekend here. So it's been a little bit harrowing, and y'all have been the kindest, most patient people I've ever dealt with. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for tolerating our very bumbly month. I'm grateful. So anyway, now we finally get to grow some mushrooms here, and I couldn't be more excited. Um, I'm getting my big pitcher of water. If you had time to soak your mushrooms before, or not your mushrooms, if you had time to soak your straw before we hop down here, awesome, good job. If you didn't, and you're building along with us right now, you want to just get that in some hot water to steep while we talk for a few minutes, and then we'll go through the assembly process. But it's really simple. I'll show you the straw part first so that everyone's on the same page, and then we'll get going here. So first, I gotta show off my jars. This is where I keep my freshest mushroom cultures when we start them. Um, Mushroom culture, I should have shown you to do the straw first, but I always get excited about this. So this is mushroom culture. And I don't know how well you can see that, but that actually has, this one's kind of a baby one, so it's just got a little thing swimming in there. But it's a living mushroom tissue suspended in nutrient. And what happens is you take this jar, it's a regular mason jar and or ball jar, I guess is the brand, and we drill 2 holes in the top of it. And then we put this is called a self-healing injection port, which you can get a big pack of them online. They're inexpensive, but what happens is it makes it so you can inject mushroom tissue or other culture or whatever in there or extract it out of there without anything getting contaminated in here. So you actually just take water and you add a tablespoon of either honey or light malt extract, and then you fill it the rest of the way with water, and you pressure cook this jar for like 45 minutes, 15 psi. And then once it's cooled, you inject either living mushroom tissue or like mushroom grown out on a petri dish, or you can even use a existing mushroom culture as long as it's like 1 or 2 generations in. I'll go a little more into that in a little bit so that I don't fly off into the moon with the science of it. But there's several things you can add to there. And what happens is that actually grows out using the honey or malt extract you put in there. And that turns into mushroom culture. And so what you use mushroom culture for is to start spawn. So you either received grain spawn or sawdust spawn. Either of those you use to add to whatever you're going to grow your mushrooms on. And it's really neat, but it only takes, this is a 800 milliliter jar, and it only takes about 1 milliliter of that to start enough spawn to grow a 5-gallon bucket of mushrooms. So like if you have one of our mushroom kits, those are culture-based kits. And if you bought a culture from someone else, you typically receive a syringe like this, um, full of that mushroom culture. And what happens is you just inject like that much into a bag of straw or not straw, rice or another grain. And you use paper bandage tape to tape the top of that shut. Or if you're going more advanced, there's different types of mushroom bags that we'll get into in a little bit if you're into going advanced with it. But the simple version is you add some of this to a bucket or a bag of brown rice, and then you let that sit for a few weeks. And what happens is you get this fluffy white stuff growing all over it. Or if you're doing like pink oyster mushrooms, sometimes that will look bright pink. This is a big bag of it, but so this fluffy white stuff grows all over it. And that is actually mycelium. So that is the underground network of the forest, really. It's anywhere you're seeing mushrooms grow above the surface, there are actually a huge web of this going on. And there are some bodies of mycelium that are just ancient and they're huge. There's one in the UP that weighs well over a ton and it takes up a big segment of space underground. So, oh, let's see. Hi, Diane. I just saw your comment here. Glad you're here. So just so everyone knows, we have the question and answer box here. And let's see, I'm trying to make it. I've been trying to figure out all week if there's a way to make this show, like actually write out the question that I'm answering it. But I don't know if it does. So I'm just going to try and do a really good job of making sure I actually read the question out loud before I answer it. So anyway, this is grain spawn. This is really good grain spawn. I'm actually really excited about it. But what happens is anytime you see mushrooms growing out of the ground somewhere, there's a whole lot of this underneath. Mushrooms are actually just the reproductive fruit of the mycelium. And so the main purpose of a mushroom is actually to go out, spread the spores, and carry on that body of mycelium. Trees use mycelium to send messages through it to their seedlings. There are many, many things that mycelium does underground, from helping move water to different nutrients to they actually communicate. The mushrooms can actually communicate with each other through mycelium using electrical impulses. So blue oyster mushrooms have been found to have a language of at least 50 words. We don't know what those words are yet, but it is pretty incredible. And it's been proven that mycelium does have at least a short-term memory. And when you're looking at their ability to transmit data and all of these things, then you start thinking about, well, if you can store data and you can communicate, how do we crack this? How do we figure out what's stored in that? And I'm fascinated by it. So anyway, that's part of my research. The Pat from Canby, Indiana says, if I purchase fresh mushroom culture, how do you store it and how long can it last? Shelf life. Good question. So I'm supposed to click the answer live button. Okay, so mushroom culture, like blue oyster culture, has a really long shelf life, I've noticed. So it lasts a little longer than the parameters I'm about to say. I've usually seen that stay good for about 14 months. Most mushroom culture you can put in the fridge indefinitely. With the exception of pink oyster mushroom. Pink oyster mushroom does not like the fridge. It's originally a tropical mushroom, and so it prefers to just be warmer. Most of the different types of mushroom cultures or mycelium or mushrooms themselves will go dormant once they go below 50 degrees. But that's usually a good thing because you can store them and keep your cultures for a long time. And so if you have your like collection of culture, like I collect culture before I even started the Mushroom Conservatory, when I was just growing and exploring, I started collecting cultures, and I really like getting cultures from all over the world, and just like rare ones or strange and unusual ones, even the ones locally that are just pop up and you're like, we've never seen one of those before. I found an amethyst tooth a couple months ago, and that was really cool. But anyway, you can keep any of the cultures that we carry are good for at least 6 months at room temperature. But if you want to keep them for long term, you can put any of those in a plastic bag in the fridge, or if you don't like plastic, put it in a jar or something in the fridge. You don't have to take it out of the syringe, just something to keep it from getting fridgeness on it. And you can just put that in the fridge. I usually keep them in the crisper drawer just so you don't get too frosty. But if you do that, I've had cultures last 2 years that way. I do tend to aim to use my culture within a year, even if I kept it in the fridge, just because it's got a lot of gusto that way. But room temp, we tell people 6 to 9 months. There's some wiggle room on that. We tell them a shorter time frame just so that if you're like, oh no, it's been 9 months, it's getting to that point that then you would want to just jump on it and do it before it is actually too late. So so yeah, but 6 to 9 months is a really good rule of thumb for culture. If you're storing it at room temperature, it's not getting too warm where it's going to be growing like wild. And as long as it looks as long as it looks like there's still a gel in there and it's not looking like gritty or cloudy, like this is a good one. I'm happy with this culture, and it's kind of hard to tell on this camera. I don't know. Here, kind of, you can kind of see, not really, but it looks like there's a pretty nice thin gel floating in there. As long as it looks like that, it's fine. If it's starting to go bad, you'll notice like it'll have a lot of sediment sitting on the bottom if you hold it like this and not much floating around here. That to me is a big indicator that something's up. You might see after some months some like white stuff starting to grow up towards the cap or something. That's actually just more mycelium forming, trying to find any source of air that it detects. That's perfectly fine. You can still use it. If that starts turning like black and coming out, it's probably contaminated, meaning there's some kind of other mold or something fighting it. Not really the end of the world, but you don't want to bother using it. It'll waste your time. Um, but yeah, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. 6 to 9 months. Sorry for the long answer on that. All right, let me show you straw really quick before I get too enthusiastic and forget to show you the important stuff. So what you're gonna do, you got one of two kinds of containers for this. You either got one of these tall things, these are really cool. Um, this is the one I started in our first session, and I've been really excited because this is a blue oyster spawn and it's growing really fast. Blues and pinks always grow really fast. Lion's mane grows medium fast. This blue is growing faster than anything I've ever seen. And you can actually see some little mushroom pins starting to form there. And ultimately what's going to happen is this is paper bandage tape over some holes here. And you'll see little tiny mushroom pins. Those are little baby mushrooms. You'll see those starting to push through the tape. And when that happens, you just peel the tape off. That happens after a few weeks after you set up your bucket. And then you peel the tape off, and then you just mist above the hole with water. And actually have a little volunteer blade of grass happening here. That happens sometimes. It's totally fine. I've noticed if I get some straw that has a lot of seed in it, then you'll wind up with that once in a while, especially if you did cold pasteurization where you're probably not going to kill off any seeds or anything. When you do hot water pasteurization, it's not as likely to happen. Either way, it's not a problem, but it is kind of goofy looking. It's kind of like a uninvited chia pet. So, all right, straw. So there are two, oh, this is the other kind of container. They hold about the same amount. I really like these guys. They're both, I can never make up my mind whether I like these or the other ones better. These ones are cool because if you do a few kinds, you can stack them. Those ones I like the tower effect and they tend to get a little cascadey on the side, so it's cool. Either way, I sent you each some straw here. And this is chopped straw. If you are a regular gardener or you spend time on a farm, you probably already know that. But basically, they take this and clean it and chop it, and you can just buy this in compressed bales at like the farm supply store. And I've been using, I had my bag of this sitting around somewhere. I'll I had it in the other thing. I'll make sure to list what this brand is. I found them on accident. I found them at Tractor Supply, I think. And there are a couple brands of chopped straw, but this one in particular has really impressed me with how clean it is. Some brands of chopped straw, it's like, it's fine. It's okay if it's a little bit dirty. You can pasteurize that out. But it's a really nice jump ahead when you're growing mushrooms if it's already pretty clean. Just because the idea, a lot of times when you're growing mushrooms, people will talk about, you need to avoid contamination. And when they're talking about that, they don't really mean it in the typical like hazmat situation, contamination. It's more like the world around us, in our homes, outside, everywhere. There are little spores floating around. It's just part of the environment we live in. And some of those, if they land on the right source, are going to grow mold. Some of them are just, there's all kinds of organisms in the air around us. So the idea when growing mushrooms is that you want the particular kind of spore that you're growing to land and grow in what you want without other types of spore-based things trying to compete with it, because that will weaken your mushrooms and can sometimes cause them to stop growing. A very common one is trichoderma, and that is that greenish, bluish mold that you might see grow on vegetables. You might actually see it in your garden sometimes. But if you get it in mushrooms, it will eventually halt your mushroom growth. And if that spores from that come off and get in your growing space or on your other mushroom buckets, then it's a lot more work to like completely get rid of that and then, make it so that your mushrooms can thrive. The weird thing is, if it's in your garden, it's actually really good for your garden. So if you wind up somehow with a moldy mushroom bucket, the world is not ending, but you might want to put it in your compost pile. The only exception we give to that is if you're doing golden oyster mushrooms. Those we're monitoring very carefully right now. It's a really interesting situation, but basically, the golden oyster mushrooms are not native to the Midwest. They're from, I believe, originally Japan. I could be wrong, but I believe they're originally from Japan. And they escaped from a mushroom factory in Illinois, is the word. And what's happened is they've gotten out into the wild. Like they were throwing out tons and tons and tons of mushroom blocks in one heap, and those eventually fruited, and then the spores happened, and slowly it's made its way across the Midwest. But what's happening is really fascinating because instead of working like a typical invasive species, it's actually going out and cleaning up pollution and deadwood about 5 times faster than it would happen naturally. The downside of that is that there's creatures and different organisms that live in some of that wood that it's decomposing faster. So there is a disruptor factor. But on the flip side, it seems to be on its own mission to clean up the ecosystem around us faster than we've figured out how to. So I will try not to dive into it too deep. I'm doing a talk on it on New Year's Day. So if you want to hear all about saving the planet with mushrooms and cleaning up our ecosystem and all the cool stuff about that, I will be doing a full-blown talk on that. And that's going to be really fun. So you can tune in. I'll make sure to send out the link. But the short version is golden oyster mushrooms are amazing. We are encouraging people not to throw them in their compost pile after their blocks are done, just because they are moving so rapidly across the Midwest, and we need to understand a little bit more about what they're doing and what's being displaced before we say let them go wild. Otherwise, you can put your mushroom blocks, any of the other oyster varieties, lion's mane, shiitake, especially any native species, if you know it grows locally, like pour it into the compost pile. But it's fantastic for your garden. You let that sit in there and work through your soil. It helps aerate your soil. It actually helps remove toxins from your soil. It's absolutely amazing what it does for your garden. So very big fans of my science. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. We need to get this straw pasteurized, which means get rid of as much possible contamination as possible so that it's clean to grow on and doesn't try to compete with your mushrooms. There are 2 ways to do that. What I'm doing today, I'm just going to do hot water pasteurization. Or we're going to go over hot water pasteurization. I am secretly using cold water because I wanted to show you how to put it in the bucket, but I also don't want to put my hands in hot water. So I'm using cold water, but hot water for this. You could also do this process cold pasteurization, but I'm going to show you this first before I talk more and forget to put the straw in water. So what you're going to do, I just have a pitcher of water here. And I'm going to take my straw. You can use regular straw. I like to cut it up a little bit smaller if I'm doing small buckets, just because it takes up a lot of space and it's easier to get it all to fit in a small container. If you're doing 5 gallon buckets or something, it's completely okay to not chop it up, and we can do that. And I am like totally Lucille balling this right now. I have too much water in this pitcher. So anyway, what you do, probably just take like a big soup pot and you're gonna put your boil hot water in it, put your straw in there, and this you don't want it to sit there with the pot boiling. You just turn off the pot, let it cool. And just gonna let that get down to room temperature. I don't think I could have done this a more messy way. All right. So I'm just gonna let this straw sit in this pitcher while I talk a little longer, and then I'll show you how to set up some other stuff. But so if you're gonna do straw for like with hot water, and you're doing a small container, do it in a soup pot on the stove, boil your water, put however much straw you need to fill your bucket in there, let it steep till it cools. If you're going to do larger buckets, if you're excited to grow maybe a lot, you're going to preserve it, do canning or freeze dry it or something, or maybe you want to do a farmer's market, you would want to go ahead and get into cold pasteurization. I do cold pasteurization for most of my bigger growing setups. We started out doing hot water pasteurization for everything. But when you're doing huge containers full of hot water pasteurized straw, that involves lugging a lot of hot water. It's kind of dangerous. There's just a lot to it. We set up a mushroom growing program for the University of Michigan for their sustainable living experience. In the first setup we did, we had 60 buckets to set up, 5 gallon buckets. And there were 2 flights of stairs in between where the water was getting boiled and where the straw was getting steeped in water. And so it was a very uh very heavy lifting day for everyone. And so at that point, I had heard of cold water pasteurization and decided to give it a try. And when it comes to doing a lot of straw at once, I haven't looked back. Basically, what we do for that, you take a big, like I use a I use a 55 gallon drum, like one of those big white plastic barrels. And by trial and error, we learned drill like an inch from the bottom of that, drill a hole and put a cooler tap in. So when you're done pasteurizing your straw, you can drain out that water. Otherwise, you're left with a huge barrel full of water and straw. That's very difficult to work with, and you can't move it or anything. And if you don't use the straw in time and then you just need to empty it, it's a whole series of efforts required. So we usually do that, and I'm looking for my hydrated lime so I can show you that. Hang on, I'm gonna grab the hydrated lime so that I can show you what I'm talking about really quick, and I will be right back. While you are waiting, it's gonna be like less than 60 seconds, but while you're waiting, if you're working on your straw right now, check on it. If you've been boiling water, it's probably been boiled enough. Just check on your straw. I'll be back in like 2 seconds with this hydrated lime. And feel free to submit any questions that are on your mind in the Q&A box here, and I'll answer them as I go. All right, found it. So this is hydrated lime, and this is one of my favorite mushroom growing tools. It saves us so much work. Basically, if you're into gardening, you've probably seen hydrated lime for doing soil remediation, where you need to raise the pH level or make some kind of adjustment to your soil quality for gardening. A lot of tomato people and pepper people really like this stuff. So, and don't ask me for gardening tips. Go to Luke over at My Gardener. He will tell you the correct things. My tomatoes and jalapenos came out so tiny this year. It was like, what is this? Produce for mice. It was very tiny, but it was really cute. But I am much better at mushrooms than I am at produce. So anyway, this is hydrated lime. And what we use it for is to do cold pasteurization with mushrooms. So what happens is you take your barrel, and you don't have to do a 55-gallon drum of straw at once. But if you're doing a bunch of 5-gallon buckets, it goes really quick, and you might as well. Mushroom growing is one of those things where it's not very labor intensive, but there's like, if you might as well set up a couple because it doesn't take much more work to do that. Um, I've also realized that one bale of straw is exactly the right size for a 55-gallon drum. If you do bigger than that, like you try to put two in, when everything expands and gets unbaled, it can get pretty jammed into the barrel there. So one bale of straw in one 55-gallon drum, but you could also use a 5-gallon bucket. You could also use a Rubbermaid tub, whatever. For a 55-gallon bucket, I only use about between a third of a cup and a cup of this. Never use more than a cup. That would just be outrageous. But really, like third of a cup is perfectly adequate. What happens, you put your scoop of hydrated lime powder, and it is, I don't want to get this all over the place, but let me just show you what it looks like a little bit. So it is this just plain white powder that I now have all over my laptop. And what you do is put a third of a cup of that into a 55-gallon drum, then drop your bale of straw in there, and then get the garden hose and you just fill that all the way up with cold water and let it sit for like 12 hours. And what happens is it raises the pH level way up in your water, and then that wears off and fades away. And you just have clean straw that's had any microbes, germs, mold spores, anything that's hiding in there gets killed off so that you have clean, fresh straw ready to work with. So this is really helpful. It keeps you from having to boil tons of water, is safe to use, and I've been really happy with it. So a bag like this will keep most of you, even if you're growing for markets, busy for a very long time. I go through one of these bags like at least every 2 or 3 months, but it's because I'm constantly growing mushrooms or showing people how to, or whatever. So I just go through it like none other. But a bag of this, you could get a much smaller bag. I don't know why this is the smallest bag they had at the store recently, but I did stock up for the next 2 months pretty good here. Anyway, but what we're doing is hot water pasteurization, which is very simple. You just steep your straw in hot water, let it sit. I try to do at least 4 hours if I'm doing a big container. Longer is always great. Mushrooms are 80% water, but so the more time they have to really steep in straw, especially for bigger containers, the better. When you're doing a small container, I've found that it does not matter as much how long. Like this is my, demo bucket. I'm showing you the process here, but like realistically, my demo bucket's going to grow really well. And it's plenty hydrated already. So just with bigger containers, I try to give it a longer steep. But this, I'm already happy with how it's doing. So, all right. So the next thing you'll see is when you got your buckets from us. So we, I've been using these buckets for workshops for quite a while, and they're just handy. But we do holes in these about that big. That's about, I think that's about half an inch. If you were doing a 5-gallon bucket, you could do the same size hole, or you could go a little bit bigger. I try not to go smaller than that. I've done way smaller than that, and you can even do like the size of an eraser head. But the problem we've run into is mushrooms, they grow out of the hole, and they can get very heavy as they grow if they're getting pretty big. And so if they only had a tiny hole to grow out of, that means they only have that much mycelium holding onto them. And so once they hit a certain weight, they could fall off. So giving them a decent sized hole gives them something to hold on to so they don't fall off. But if you do too big of a hole, you're going to be getting too much air into your bucket and things will get a little drier than you'd like. If it gets too dry, then you're going to wind up with like very tiny little, like hard as a rock mushrooms. They're cute, but not very useful. You can grind them up and use them as seasoning, but that's about it. So you do this, and it took me a couple years to figure this one out, but this is called step bit. Um, you may not be familiar with these. These are awesome. They're usually, I get them in 3 packs at Harbor Freight for like 15 bucks, and they're awesome. And what happens is instead of using a regular drill bit, which a regular sharp, fresh drill bit will actually like rip up your bucket and you'll wind up with little like chunks out of it like that, where it just cracks away at the plastic, or sometimes it will crack your bucket all the way through. Um, so if you're drilling buckets and you want it to be like nice, clean, tidy holes, then this is really the way to go. It saves so much frustration and you just use it. I do have, don't laugh at my, don't laugh at my drill. This is my little generic drill here. But so it just works just like a regular drill bit. And you just drill it like normal. And I had a student recently recommend that if you didn't have one of these, another really good solution is to use a dull drill bit where the end has gotten worn out, is kind of rounded off just from use. Those work a lot better than a sharp drill bit will on plastic if you do not have access to a step bit. But just get a step bit and keep it with your mushroom growing stuff. It's useful for a million things, but yeah, really great little tool. So what happens is we drill the bucket on this size bucket or on this size. See, I did 3 holes on either of these. And the reason for that is because usually when someone has this size bucket, these are gallon capacity. When someone has these size bucket, they tend to set them on their kitchen counter. And when you set something on your kitchen counter, you don't think to look at the back of it for a very long time. And so I used to put holes on all 4 sides, but I realized that I was getting like, I would think that my mushrooms weren't growing. And then I would realize that there were sneaky ones growing in the back that I didn't even catch in time. So we started for these size that fit well on a counter. We typically just drill 3 holes. That way they can grow on these 3 sides of it, but no sneaky ones escaping. And then the other thing is you can put it like this one. This one is the holes are up higher. You could do them like a snowman where you do the buttons down in the front. You could do them on a diagonal. You can do them however. At that point, it's more with any of these varieties where you're working with oyster mushrooms or with lion's mane, you can get more just visually creative with that. And so I enjoy that. And you'll also find if you mess up a bucket, don't be afraid to still use it. We've had a few people that drilled buckets and wound up with like a big crack. And so they still used them and just out of curiosity to see what would happen. And we thought, oh, maybe it'll get too dry or something. But actually, what happened was they had this really cool cascading effect where you would get like a normal cluster of mushrooms here, and then that crack would just have like smaller and smaller mushrooms coming out. So if you're looking for a visually cool display of mushrooms, don't give up on your cracked buckets. So we drill those. And then your buckets, probably all saw this is paper bandage tape on here. And we pre-taped your buckets. But basically this is just medical paper bandage tape. You don't want the cloth kind. You really want to use the paper kind. And the reason for that is it's designed to be able to breathe, but keep out any like microbes or anything that you wouldn't want to get into your bucket. And so it's a very useful little tool for mushroom buckets. We also use it if you're making grain spawn. After you add that culture to your bag with rice, you just tape the bag shut at the top with that so that it can breathe, but nothing gets in or out. And you can also use it on those culture jars if you were making a culture jar where you tape over one of the two holes you made. So it's got an air filter because that air helps it grow. So here, all right. So what you're going to do is take your bucket. And of course, I did not think to pre-tape my own bucket, so I'll tape mine afterwards. You're gonna take your alcohol wipe. Everyone should have gotten a handful of these. And I'm gonna wipe down the inside of your bucket. Now, I use alcohol wipes a lot to wipe down buckets. It works well. I don't run into many issues. Peroxide does kill off more organisms than rubbing alcohol will. The only thing with peroxide is if it gets on your skin, you get those horrible little dry burns. I don't like what peroxide does to my hands. So I generally only use that if I'm wearing gloves. Um, and again, using alcohol wipes is perfectly fine for this, but it is handy, so don't be afraid to use that for cleaning buckets as you're about to use them. Just watch your skin with that. So anyway, I'm just giving this a good wipe down, making sure there's no extra potential potential for contamination on here. And don't have to really do the outside a lot. I just, I don't know, habit. And you'll run into like two kinds of mushroom growers. There are the people who are like extreme, I won't say germaphobe, but they're extreme sterile procedure. Make sure absolutely everything is completely sterilized down to the absolute everything. And then you'll run into the more like farmer gardener side of things who are more like, okay, these have been, which is my leaning. Some processes like culture making I'm very sterile for, but in general, setting up mushroom buckets, I lean much more the farm direction, the gardening, hands-on direction, which is mushrooms have been growing just fine in nature without us for a very long time. There are plenty, every single microbe we have floating around here is also floating around outside. And I think it's really just a matter of like doing a decent job, making sure everything is clean and everything, but I don't tend to overdo it. I've heard of other people who like they insist that if you're going to work on your buckets, like first you have to take a shower 10 seconds before you're going to grow your mushrooms and then pull your clothes out of the dryer hot and put them on and put on a mask and rub down your hands and feet with rubbing alcohol and all kinds of things. And I so respect that approach, but that's not really how I approach things. Um, just make sure you wipe stuff down really well. Make sure your hands are clean. And by clean, I mean like really clean, like soap and water. And if you have like overhead fans going, I do generally tell people like half hour, 20 minutes before you're going to start doing this, if you're working inside, just turn off the fan so it's not kicking any extra dust around. Other than that, this it's not that intimidating. And I also have found anytime I've been struggling with contamination where I'm growing in a spot that just doesn't seem to be getting the getting as consistent of clean results, I just go outside and work on my buckets. And I have never had a bucket I set up outside get contaminated. Just set up on the deck and do a bunch of buckets there. But again, it's especially oyster mushrooms and lion's mane. They're very forgiving. They want to grow. The idea with contamination, especially with these varieties, is you just want them to grow faster than anything that can compete with them. So not really a big thing to stress about, but it's something that comes up a lot, and it's something that intimidates people and makes them think that they can't successfully grow mushrooms. So it's important to me to talk about that a little bit. The other thing that tends to keep people from trying growing mushrooms is they think that they need to have a pressure cooker or do a lot of very advanced Breaking Bad kind of stuff. That's not the case. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with a pressure cooker. And I will talk about that in a minute, but you certainly don't have to get that complicated with it. So anyway, today I'm showing you the easiest possible way to start a really great bucket of mushrooms growing. And yeah, so let's assemble this bucket. And then once we do that, I'll talk a little bit about what to expect next, how to harvest it, and some interesting detail technique stuff, and kind of what your next steps would be if you wanted to grow on a bigger scale. All right. So what we're gonna do, you all got a bag of spawn with each bucket. Either sawdust spawn or grain spawn. The difference between sawdust spawn and grain spawn is sawdust spawn is grown on sawdust and grain spawn is grown on grain. They can be used interchangeably, with the only exception being that if you're doing an outside grow, because you can use spawn for so many things, you can use them to like make log totems where you slice up a stump and then you put layers of spawn in between each slice of stump and you let that sit, and then eventually mushrooms start growing out of that. You can use it to start a straw bed where you crumble that into straw in like a little trench by your garden. And we'll talk about plug spawn in a minute, but you can also use it to make the plugs that you would use to make a mushroom log. So, so if you're doing outdoor setups, I typically encourage people to use sawdust spawn instead of grain spawn because chipmunks and squirrels will absolutely snack up all of the grain spawn, whereas they're not going to eat the sawdust. So that's really the only usage difference. It's made the same way. To make sawdust spawn, I just sterilize sawdust and then I add a little bit of grain spawn that we've started to the mix. So like here's some other, and it looks different. Like you'll see, this is pink oyster, and there's actually like a little volunteer guy. Those are mushroom pins. Let me pull this out. So when mushrooms are just starting to grow, when they're starting to fruit, when they're starting to turn into mushrooms, that's called fruiting. So you'll see something called pins. And these are little, I'm trying to get that to focus here. Yeah, those are little, well, it focuses, yeah, little pink oyster mushroom pins. And what's wild is you'll see these start to poke out of the holes in your bucket, and then you mist above that hole with water every day. And within about a week, these turn into a full-size mushroom. You can almost see them grow. It's very surreal. And the pink ones taste like bacon, so it's pretty neat. Um, so that, and you'll see sometimes that your spawn gets a few of those little volunteers going on there. That's completely okay. It just means that your spawn is very alive and happening. If it sits too long at room temperature, you will wind up with just like your spawn is trying to grow mushrooms with all of its might, and it doesn't have enough to sustain that. So you'll notice that it gets a little worn out if it sits and does that for too long. But if you just have a couple of those little pins, it's no biggie. So we will take your spawn, and this is for this size bag or this size bucket that we're doing. This is enough spawn for two of those buckets. I think this is a little bit more than you probably have. Like each bag for these sets was measured to be for one bucket, erring a little bit on the side of excess to make sure you have enough. But this bag I threw extra in, so this is like enough right here to do two of those bags. Or you could put this in a 5 gallon bucket with the same method we're doing, and it might take a little bit longer to colonize and start growing, but you could do a 5 gallon bucket with this much. So. And again, feel free to submit any questions you want through the Q&A box, and I am glad to answer as much as I can. But what we're going to do here, so once you've wiped down your bucket, you've got your straw and everything's ready. And I would typically tape, usually I tape the bucket before I get started. I just didn't walk in here with my roll of tape, so I'm going to tape mine when we're done here. But your buckets came pre-taped, so you got that. Again, that's paper bandage tape. awesome tool to have. It's like $1.50 at the grocery store if you look right next to the Band-Aids. And a roll of that will last about as long as your hydrated lime if you buy it at the same time. So you're gonna start out just putting a nice base layer of straw in here. And so for the gardeners, you're looking for, you've probably heard the term field capacity for your soil. Is the same for this. You want field capacity straw. And so you put this right, you just want to put like a nice layer. So if it seems too soggy, just squeeze out any extra butter. Hi, Maria. I see your question here. You're just saying it has a little blue-green on it. Send me a picture of that. I'll take a look at it when I hop off, and I'll check it for you. And if there's anything up with it, I'll just send you another bag. But yeah, we'll check it for you. All right. Or actually, I'm just thinking if you're Maria, if you're going live right now, if you want to send me a picture, I'll check my phone really quick and take a look at it just so that you know while you're working on your bucket. And if not, then I'll check it once we're done. But I just want to make sure you're set. All right, so put put an inch here. You could do like 2 inches. You just want to make sure it's got a little base there so it's not all sitting at the bottom. You want your you want to squeeze enough water out of this so you're not getting a bunch of water pooling in the bottom of your bucket. And then you're going to take your spawn and you're not going to use a ton here. I should bring this up closer just so I can show you. All right, so I've got like this inch or so, and I've got, see that? Got about that much spawn. That's a good handful for this. So sprinkle this over the top. You don't need a ton per layer. You just want some like over the top of that straw. And then you put another layer. And so we call this the lasagna method. And you're just going to continue going. Every layer of straw should be about 1 or 2 inches. If you're using a bigger bucket, you might be able to go a little deeper with your layers, but I like about 1 or 2 inches for this particular size bucket. Again, if you have the square bucket, same process, same depth of layers. And then you just keep going with this crumbles, crumbles of spawn and layers of straw. And you're going to do that all the way up to the top. You want to leave yourself at least 1 inch of head space. You don't want too much, but you just leave yourself a little bit. And actually what happens is as your mushrooms sit, they start building up CO2 in the bottom of that, in the top of that thing. And that's part of what helps them to know to push down and grow out the sides of the bucket. And people always want to take their lid off the bucket to peek on everything, even with a clear bucket, it's a thing. They always want to take the lid off and peek at it a few a few hundred times before they're ready. But the problem with doing that is you're actually letting all of the CO2 out of the bucket. And so you can wind up with mushrooms that are like growing up the wrong direction or turning out weird shapes. And you just don't wind up with the optimal mushroom when you're doing that. So you really do want to try and leave the lid on, with one exception, which is in between harvests, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And so with mushrooms, each round of harvest is called a flush. And uh, each bucket tends to get 2 or 3 flushes per bucket. So in between in between flushes, you're going to actually you cut off your mushrooms, and I'll send out an email later with photos of exactly what to look for with your mushrooms to know that they're ready to harvest. But then once you harvest them, and you cut the mushrooms off the side of the bucket, then you actually take the lid off and you can stick this in a pot of water overnight. And you're going to need something heavy because mycelium floats. So they're actually making like surfboards and all kinds of interesting flotation devices out of mycelium now. But if you if you put that in a pot with just lukewarm room temperature water, put some heavy on top to hold it down, but make sure it's got water in the whole thing. You let that sit overnight and then you drain it back out. Um, then you put the lid back on in the morning, set it back on your shelf, and it'll actually get going again in a week or two. And then you get another flush of mushrooms. So you can do that 2 or 3 times. I've seen a few where they've managed to get it going for a couple more than that. Average is 2 or 3. But sometimes a 5 gallon bucket might kick out 4. Yield wise, what you would expect is about about a pound per harvest out of a gallon sized bucket. And with a 5 gallon bucket, you're looking at more like 4 pounds per harvest. So, if you can get 12 pounds of mushrooms out of a 5 gallon bucket over the course of, you know, 8 to 12 weeks, then you can really get a lot of mushrooms um, and then you just have to decide what you're going to do with them. So I'm going to pause for just a second so I can just take a look at Maria's spawn really quick here and make sure we're all good. Keep layering your stuff, and I will be back in 1 minute. If anyone wants to take a quick intermission break, this would be a good time. Stop and use the bathroom. It's only going to take us about 5-10 more minutes to finish up our buckets, and then we'll do some Q&A and just talk about a few things and can wrap up. So Okay. All right. We're back in action here. All right. Did everyone get a 2 second break? I got my coffee. We're good here. I took a look at Maria's spawn and did have one little chunk in there that just looked kind of iffy. Not 100% sure. But I just told her to leave out that one piece and go ahead and set it up. I am going to send her an extra set just in case. But if you see like a piece that has like a bluish tint to it, tell me and we'll check it for you. You should be good, but I do try to keep a close eye on that. So you should be all right. All right, so I'm just setting up the last of my bucket here. I have a tendency to blah 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 and not layer this up as fast as I should when I'm teaching. So I'm gonna do this quickly and then keep talking about other things while I do that. So it's really this part is just you're doing your layering, making sure you're not getting too much water. You just don't want a bunch of standing water in the bottom. This one. This is like the okay amount. I try not to get more than that much water around in the bottom, just because if it sits for a long time, it tends to be more of a thing with bigger buckets, but you can wind up with that little bottom layer fermenting if you have too much water sitting in the bottom. This is pretty good. It doesn't seem like a splashy amount. There's moisture down there, which is helpful for my mushrooms, which seem to be coming along well. Uh, so. Anyway, layer, layer, layer. This goes by really, really fast if you're doing a bunch of buckets and just trying to knock them all out. So I like to I usually use 5 gallon buckets for my big grows. It's nice because they can stack. I try not to stack more than 2 buckets high unless I have like a 2x4 frames built around them, just so you don't have them tipping on people. And I tend to try to, when I'm lining up like a grow tent, I tend to try to drill the buckets thinking about like if they're going to be up against the wall or not, again with that sneaky mushrooms growing along the back. If I'm going to be lining up for a home mushroom growing for a small quantity for a couple buckets, you don't need to have a grow tent. I have a 10 by 20 foot grow tent that I use. It's awesome because it just controls your humidity and keeps everything contained, and it's wonderful. I love it. It gives you a lot of control over your growing. And if you're interested in growing for a farmer's market, or you're really into like, maybe prepping and you like to make sure you've stored up a lot of food and you're trying to grow in large quantities, a grow tent is really a great way to go. And there are a lot of people selling grow tents on Marketplace. Even, someone, sometimes you can get some really smelly ones. So you want to check what you're getting and make sure it's pretty clean before you get it, just in case you wind up with a really aromatic tent, if you know what I mean. I was very fortunate and I got a very, very clean, nice 10 by 20 Gorilla tent with the height extender on Marketplace for not even 10% of what it would have cost new. So it's a really great resource if you're wanting to get a grow tent. Like, why not invest that into your supplies instead of, paying extra for a new tent. Although I did talk to someone who's very sensitive to different smells. And so for them, it was more important to get a really new tent. And I have run into a few people around here that have sold brand new tents on Marketplace. The smaller one that I have, the 9 by 6 tent, and that one was brand new. I think maybe they set it up for 20 minutes and never did anything with it. So you can really, I mean, I think I paid $50 for it. So you can find some excellent tools there, throw a little humidifier in there. The best thing to do if you're gonna set up a grow tent. Again, we're kicking off this. It's going to be our fungi fireside chats, and every other week for the foreseeable future, I'm just going to hop on and do a talk for anyone that wants to learn and hear about mushroom things. And I'm going to be just talking about different techniques and processes. So we will do a session soon that's just talking about how to set up a mushroom growing tent if you're trying to set up, a nicer setup that you're going to use for a while. But one of my tricks for if you've got a small grow tent set up, you don't want to invest in a huge humidification system. Get a decent quality ultrasonic humidifier, the kind that has like the snorkel thing on it, and then set it up. You can use like those 30-gallon water drums or even like the 5-gallon things you get at the grocery store are pretty great. But you put that on top and it feeds the water from there. But set it up outside of your grow tent and get some ducting, just some thin ducting from Home Depot. Duct tape that on the end of where the snorkel comes out and then feed that through there's different ports along a grow tent to let in different tubing and stuff. You do that, and that way it can feed humidity in, but you're not going to fry the electronics on your humidifier, which I learned the hard way on my favorite humidifier before we started doing this. So this is a really good solution if you want to run a humidifier that way to pump water in there. Speaking of water, a lot of people ask about what kind of water they can use. Can you use tap water? Can I use city water? Does it need to be distilled? We're on a well. We're out in the boonies. I use well water. We have a pretty high iron content in our well water, but it's clean, good water, and so we use that. I typically the only time I won't use that is if we've put salt in the water softener in the past few days because it's still kind of concentrated. Salt is a fungi inhibitor, and so it's kind of counterintuitive if you've just reset your water purifier. So, so if you're on a well, just use your tap water. It's great. If you're in a city, you kind of want to check and see what kind of treatment your city does on water. Like for instance, we lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan for a while, and they do not put many chemicals in their water for treating it. So I felt good using that water for mushroom growing, and I didn't run into any issues. The city of Detroit goes pretty heavy on their water treatment, and I would not use that. Like you can smell the chlorine on it. And it's not great for your mushrooms. And obviously, you may not want that in something you're consuming like that. So just pay attention to what your local water is being treated with as the guideline. But if you're on heavily treated city water, I typically would recommend getting a jug of distilled water or visiting a friend who's on well water. But for the most part, it's pretty flexible. An interesting thing, we worked with a program in Uganda where all these students were learning how to grow mushrooms and starting their own micro businesses and growing for market and to feed their families. In Uganda, just having a midday meal at school is not really a thing. So this program was making it so, not only could they start these businesses and be bringing home food, but they had lunches. And it's a really powerful way to grow food in places where it's not so easy to find food. And so I'm really invested in working with pockets of the world where hunger is extreme and finding ways to work with their local resources to grow mushrooms and make it doable. So in Uganda, they are growing on dried banana leaves instead of straw, and it works really, really well. Turns out mushrooms love banana leaves. And what we're running into with this particular project is their water source is not clean. It's a well, and it's got every kind of bacteria and every like not like a well like we have, like a very contaminated well with water that you just shouldn't be consuming. And they were running into issues with, every time they would get their mushrooms established and they would be colonized, and kind of be to this point, and they'd have all their bags lined up in their growing space and be going good. And then, they're misting everything with water every day. And then things would get moldy and bad or start going very wrong. And um, there wasn't a simple way to clean that water. And what we ultimately wound up figuring out was that you could get this water decent enough to use for mushroom growing by actually putting it in a barrel in direct sunlight for 24 hours. You let it sit for 2 days in the sun, basically. That's called solar sterilization. It's not going to filter out every single thing in that water, but it will kill off any bacteria and mold and stuff. So you can use that. So, I think many of the people on here today are, able to use more of a conventional water source. But if you were in a situation where you're in the wilderness and needing to work with maybe some adaptive methods, it was a really cool way to figure out how to use the available water and work with it. So, all right, so I've got this almost full up here. Just getting the last of it. In about 2 seconds, I'm going to check my questions list. So feel free to fire any questions in and we'll figure it out. All right. So I'm landing right about there. My bucket. I guess I'll put a little handful more, but I would be happy with that. I'm just putting a little more straw in just because, but that's pretty good. And then I guess I didn't bring a lid out. At this juncture, you would put your lid on and you have your mushroom growing bucket. You do that, and then you would just set this in your kitchen, laundry room, wherever it's going to be kind of a steady temperature and not drop down below 55 degrees is going to be fine. Um, you're going to let it sit probably, say about 3 weeks. You're going to see it kind of getting to this point where I mean, this bucket is colonizing really fast. So I think we're going to see some mushrooms sooner than you usually would out of the blues. You have the same spawn, so if you have blue, you're likely to see that see that happen too. This spawn has just really amazed me this time. But anyway, so in a couple weeks, you're gonna see this. It's gonna look like it's all covered with this white stuff. You know, right now you can see your straw. Put your lid on, leave your lid on, put it on the counter on top of the fridge. It can be in a closet. A lot of people think that mushrooms have to grow in total darkness, but they actually need a little bit of light to know which way is up. They don't photosynthesize the way a plant does, but they do use light to know which way they're going. And also, if oyster mushrooms, they haven't run this test on lion's mane yet, but I have a feeling it's likely the same for both. But with oyster mushrooms, if you let them get a little bit of sunlight, it actually makes their vitamin D levels go way up. So it's a wonderful source of vitamin D, which I believe this is the only naturally occurring source of vitamin D that is a non-meat, um, unless you count fish. So, so that's pretty amazing. But you're gonna let it sit for 3 weeks or so. And then, sometimes 4 weeks. Lion's mane can be a pinch longer, but you just let it sit and you don't need to do anything. You just need to leave the lid on and then you keep an eye on that tape. So what's gonna happen is, oh, do we have, I think we actually have some pins happening here that I can show you. So what you'll find is your mushrooms are gonna probably grow out of 1 or 2 holes, but not all three. So you just kind of, when it's getting into that end zone where you think you might be about to get some ones appearing, which this is kind of a good indicator, is there's really like a big cluster of white around where this hole is. And I just noticed that it's actually doing this, but when you see those little pins starting to try to push through, you can just peel your tape off. Yeah. And so, like, if you look right here, this is gonna be kind of hard to see, but I'm gonna see if I can show you here. So if you see, that's hard to see. If you see, there's like these little tiny, you can't see anything that I'm doing right now. Okay, well, there's these little tiny white bumps right there. And so, like, I'm actually gonna leave the tape off of this tonight and just start misting this bucket. And I'll send out pictures in a couple of days so you can see what that progression looks like. I'm super excited right now. I never stop getting excited when you have the pins start to pop out. But so you'll see that after a few weeks, it'll start happening. You peel the tape off. Usually you're not gonna like notice at this stage, you'll just see like a little bump trying to push through that and you peel it off. If you don't catch it in time, you can actually peel, or if you, it'll actually like push through the tape. So it's not gonna ruin it. It's just they tend to turn out a slightly nicer shape if you pull it off for them, but they are pretty strong and they'll push through it. Anyway, when it's time to peel off the tape, you just do that, set it on your counter, and you just mist above each hole with water once or twice a day. You let it sit there. After about a week, you're going to have these awesome mushrooms. And it's really cool because every day it's going to look completely different. Every morning it's going to look like by evening it'll look different than it did when you woke up. So I really like taking like a daily photo or two just because the progression is so neat to see. And it makes it easier to explain to people like, hey, like this is what just happened. It was incredible. So I'm gonna do that, get these big mushrooms are gonna start happening. And then after about a week, you'll be at the full size point. I'll send out some photos in a little bit with what to look for, but you'll notice on the oyster caps, both blue and pink, that edge of the cap will just be slightly curled under, like almost like the edge of an ear or something, just slightly curled under. And that's the perfect moment to harvest it. If they, once they flatten out, because they'll just kind of do that fairly rapidly, once they flatten out, that's when they start dropping spores. And then when they start dropping spores is when they start to decompose. So you'll notice at that point, the edges of the cap get ruffly. I've eaten them when they're like right at that point, but once they're past that slightly curled under edge, you lose a little bit of the flavor and texture. Pink oyster mushrooms tend to decompose a lot faster than blue or lion's mane, but but you can save either in the fridge for uh, like like pinks. I usually won't do more than 5 days in the fridge. You put it in a paper bag, but they do best in a paper bag in the crisper drawer. Blues I've had last just fine for 10 days in the fridge in a paper bag. For lion's mane, the shaggy look that lion's mane has, those little shaggy things are called the teeth. And you want the teeth to be about a quarter of an inch long, and that's the perfect time to harvest them. Longer than that, they look cool, but they're getting close to being done. So you do like that quarter inch is like the perfect time, the perfect flavor. And lion's mane are really incredible. You've probably heard a little bit about the cognitive things they're starting to find out about lion's mane. I take it for focus. Maybe I should take more for focus, but they're exploring different ways to treat like traumatic brain injuries and Alzheimer's and all these things with lion's mane, but it's also very delicious. Um, I am I am super into food. I love food. I am the president of a nonprofit in Detroit called Soil to Service, which owns the Detroit Institute of Gastronomy. It's an apprenticeship-based culinary program that builds up phenomenal chefs. And it's actually, you can get an associate's degree. So it's just a cool program. But playing with flavor and texture is totally my jam and exploring different ingredients. So lion's mane has been just like an absolute love for me because if you cook it like just normal cooking, you can actually, it tastes very much like crab, and you can actually make crab cakes with it that are out of this world, and you can't even tell that it's not crab. But if you dehydrate lion's mane, it becomes chocolatey, and you can use it to make sweet things. And we've actually used it. I did no-bake cookies, and I used lion's mane powder instead of cocoa powder, and you could not tell the difference. They were so delicious. It was absolutely awesome. So you can get a lot of really cool flavor coming out of lion's mane depending on how you process it. And then with oyster mushrooms, there's such a huge range of flavor across oyster mushrooms. A lot of the times a lot of times I'll do a workshop or I'll be at an event or something, and there's always one person that comes up and they come up and they're like, I hate mushrooms. And you're like, okay, that's absolutely okay. But usually if you start talking to them, they're like, well, they're so slimy. And if you're getting slimy mushrooms, that means they're already decomposing, which is unfortunately true of a lot of what you'll find on grocery store shelves. So a lot of times when people don't like mushrooms, it's because they're getting this flavor or texture that was not what it was intended to be, or they don't know how to work with the texture if they do have good mushrooms. So one of the things that I really love about oyster mushrooms is they tend to have a much more like proteiny, velvety kind of texture, and they're less foamy. And so they lend themselves really well to almost anything that you would use a meat to make, whether that's a stir fry or barbecue or really anything. You could use oyster mushroom instead of. but then the flavor profiles across oysters are extraordinary. So you've got pink oysters, which taste like bacon, and they're beautiful and pink, and they just look amazing. You got blue oysters, which are like halfway between chicken and crab, and they have a very chickeny texture to them. So I did an article in Edible Wow magazine from this past fall where we did a oyster mushroom bulgogi, which is Korean barbecue, and that's my new favorite thing. And I'll make sure to link to that recipe, but it's a really good one. And then Black pearl oyster mushroom is kind of peppery, not in a spicy way, more in like that savory black pepper kind of nuance. King oyster mushroom, when you think of like a traditional umami mushroom flavor, that's King's. And those are really cool. They're a little different than the rest of the oysters. They grow out of the top of the bucket instead of the sides. All the other oysters grow out the sides. But King oyster mushrooms have these really thick stalks that you can slice up and sear like scallops, and they're phenomenal. And then golden oysters are kind of nutty, tangy, earthy. And I know I'm missing one. Phoenix oysters kind of have that more classic mushroom taste to them. And I know I'm missing one of my favorites. We got pink, blue, gold, black pearl, golden, Phoenix. I guess I got them. So there's that, and then obviously the lion's mane. So you can use these techniques with obviously lion's mane or any of the other mushrooms in the Hericium family. There's like bear's tooth and a few others that are really interesting. And then any of the oyster family, just if you're going to grow king oysters, you want to let them grow out the top instead of the sides. So you would then just drill an air hole or two in your lid instead of the sides of the bucket, tape that, and then when they start growing vertically, you would take the lid off and just gently mist around the base of those every day. Um, so yeah, so just one last recap on what we did with our buckets. And then if anyone has any questions, I'm glad to answer them. So you took your straw, you steeped it in hot water for a time, and then you took your grain spawn, and after you wiped down your bucket, you took your grain spawn and crumbled it in layers with your straw. And then you put your lid on, make sure you've got your tape over the holes. You let that sit for a few weeks, winds up colonized and beautiful. And then just once you get these little guys starting to grow out of the holes. You just, anywhere that they're growing out of, take the tape off of. If there's nothing growing out of it, you could either leave the tape on or take it off. Then you just mist above the holes with water once or twice a day. I usually do it like when I get up in the morning and make my coffee, and then at the end of the day when I'm just gonna go sit down and relax. It's usually my two stops. Um, but just you can use a regular spray bottle or a misting bottle. You just don't want to spray directly at the mushrooms because it can bruise them a little bit, which makes them have like a mottled cap or maybe just look a little bit bumpy from getting hit with that water. So you want to do that. And then after about a week, you'll have glorious mushrooms growing. And then it's just a matter of deciding what you're going to cook with them. And oyster mushrooms and lion's mane all taste very strange raw. I've tasted oyster raw. The student finally talked me into trying it at a workshop a couple months ago. I tried them and it's actually like they're not too bad. They're just not too good. They kind of have like a little bit of a bland metallic thing going on when they're raw. And lion's mane just tastes weird when it's raw. So when you cook these mushrooms, though, that's when they absolutely come to life. They get so much flavor. They're just awesome. And if you wind up with like more than you can use, I tend to either dehydrate them or I'll cook something with them and then freeze them, or you can can them. You can do all kinds of canned foods the same you would with any other kind of thing. One of these days we'll come up with some good mushroom canning recipes. That's on the list. But in the meantime, you can definitely adapt a lot of recipes to just include mushrooms or feature mushrooms, can them as you would. But for if you wind up with like, you've got maybe just a few little mushrooms and it's like you don't have time to cook them, but it's not really enough to go on a preserving project and it's that in between. I like to dehydrate those and then crush them up and put them in a shaker like you'd use for herbs. And you use that and you can use it for sauces, like seasoning sauces or roasts and different things. You still want it to get cooked while you're doing it to bring out the flavor. So you just, that cooking would be happening as you're shaking it into whatever you're cooking. So that's one of my favorite moves with the, with that, I have a little bit of leftover. on the mushrooms. So anyway, so you get to your harvest time, you cut those mushrooms off. You can either twist them off or slice them off. Either is fine. Soak it in water overnight, drain the water off, put the lid back on, set it on the counter, and then you let it do its thing again. And so you should get a few rounds of that. And then when it's done, any of these varieties that we're working with in this workshop, the pink, the blue, and the lion's mane, any of those are fine to just put in your compost pile when you're done and keep the delights going into your garden. So, and also again, you can use oyster mushrooms in your garden beds if you just do like a trench with straw and layer it in the same way. Uh, and I do have, if you go onto the downloads page on my website, themushroomconservatory.com, there is a PDF of our kit instructions for our oyster mushroom and lion's mane mushroom growing kits. And that does actually include a sheet in there on how you would set this up in your garden instead of in a bucket. So you could do that. And then also, I didn't talk about wine cap mushrooms today, but if you're super into gardening and you want like the awesome gardener's mushroom, those are wine caps. And you make the spawn the same way you would with the rice. You do that and then you soak wood chips, like hardwood wood chips, in water overnight, and then you work that spawn into that and kind of like you could do little like trenches along the sides of your paths in your garden, or maybe you have a raised bed or something, and you get these big, beautiful mushrooms, like a rosy cap. They taste like potatoes. They pop up a few times a year, so you can enjoy them with your garden. So that's also like a big favorite of mine. We do golden oyster or golden wine cap and regular wine cap mushrooms. They taste about the same, but per the names, the golden wine cap mushrooms have golden caps, and the regular wine caps have those rosy, kind of burgundy colored caps. All right, let's see. Hey, Rachel. All right, I have a question from Rachel. She says, if you dehydrate lion's mane for chocolate taste, do you still want to cook it too? So if you dehydrate it, typically anything I've used it in, I wind up cooking it in. But it's not like a raw meat situation where it's not going to be good for you. And so some of the times I've cooked it has been really minimal. Like one of the things that I do, I've never been able to get into the mushroom coffee thing. Like I like the idea, but the texture is just a little weird for me. I'm a coffee purist. I like my Maxwell house, and like I don't like my coffees different than it's supposed to be. And so I like everyone kept asking me about mushroom coffee. And so I started tinkering and came up. My mom's a beekeeper. And so I had this really nice jar of honey that had been like kind of crystallized, which usually people are like, don't want it crystallized, but in this case, it was the best thing ever. And they say that you shouldn't heat raw honey up past a certain point. It loses all its properties. I think it's like 160 degrees or something. And so I took powdered lion's mane and did like a really low temperature infusion of that and just let it kind of meld together. And so there was no, like, that was a low temperature, like just kind of like an hour where it was like under 160 degrees, but I had dehydrated it first. So in that case, I wasn't really doing like a full-blown cooking. I feel like dehydrating it really knocked out most of that because for me with cooking lion's mane, it's very much about getting the flavor out of it. So at that point, that works well. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But I think probably by process, it'll kind of wind up cooked into something. But you could put it directly into your, coffee or something. And again, with the texture, with putting powders into coffees, that's up in the air. But flavor wise and safety wise, you're good. Let's see. All right, Diane says, did you say between flushes you rinse the straw off and leave overnight with the lid off? Sort of. So you just soak the bucket in water overnight. You would take your bucket and pretend you just cut all your mushrooms off of there so it's ready to go. And then you would take your lid off so that it's basically, if I don't, I almost took my lid off and I don't want to because these are about to fruit and I'll mess it up. So you've got your lid off, say, and you've already harvested one round. You put this in a bucket or a pot. Like I think I actually have. I thought I had a pot I could grab, for example. I guess I have a pressure cooker here. This will be my handy demo. Or this is one of my sterilizers. It's very similar to a pressure cooker, but it's got a different kind of valve on it. And this actually makes the sterilization a little more precise. Very similar to a pressure cooker, but I do love using this thing. But this is going to be my demo pot for a second so that I can show you this. So, and if you've ever been scared of using a pressure cooker, I am going to do a little thing on this soon on using one safely, but totally, it's not scary as long as you follow the rules and you're careful. And having a good one makes a big difference. Like this is an all-American. It's cast aluminum and it's got these really nice wing nuts on top that actually clamp the lid down. So a lot of the pressure cookers you see on the market are rolled aluminum, so they're really thin and they get like pitted or dented over time as you use them. And when you hear of pressure cookers like exploding or blasting the lid off or something, typically that's a combination of a worn out pressure cooker, or maybe it has like a bad rubber gasket. This one doesn't have a gasket, it's just a metal to metal seal. But a lot of the ones on the market have a rubber thing that you have to change every few years. Or um, it can be that you didn't put enough water in. So this has been I do a lot of pressure cooker use because I do so much culture making. And so I have 12 in total. But this is just a really handy, great device that makes me a lot less nervous when I'm running a bunch of them. And I've had a few, you should never ever let your pressure cooker or sterilizer run dry, but I have had a few times where that's happened on accident and nothing, no lids blew off of anything and everything was okay. So that was really comforting and would not have been the case with a regular one. So just like kind of a side note. Anyway, pretend this is a regular pot. And you would just and take your bucket and then put it in there, fill it up with water, like room temperature, or it could be cold to lukewarm. You just don't want it to be hot. Mycelium does okay until it gets hit with about 100 degrees, and then it starts withering a little. And once it gets to 120, it starts dying. So you put it in here with some good tap water, fill it up, and then it's going to try to float. So you just want to put something heavy on top. A lot of times I'll put like a rock. Someone said they put a book, but I really love books and I don't want my books to get wet. So usually I won't put a book on top. Although one time I did put like a heavy cookbook in a plastic bag and set that on top and it worked. You just don't want it bobbing around and not all getting hydrated. So you let that sit overnight in your pot of water. Then you just strain off any extra water in there and then put your lid back on. And so then you just put it back where it was, and by another week or two, you'll have more mushrooms growing. All right. Does anyone have any more questions? Right. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground there. I feel like there was one more thing I was going to tell you about. I'm drawing a blank. I could tell you about 100 more things, but I won't. I'm sure you would like to get to your dinner and evening. But thank you again for your patience and for being here and being part of this. I'm here if you run into questions, if you're like, well, what is this bucket doing? If you're setting it up and you're not sure if something's working right, or you feel like it's taking too long for them to fruit. Sometimes I know for me, I always get antsy about 2 days before they actually start popping up. And I'm like, are they going to grow? When are they going to grow? And then all of a sudden they're growing. So there is always that moment of anticipation. And that's okay too. If you're like, is it going to happen? You can send me a note. You can send me a picture. I'm always happy to like do a status check and see how it's going. And I really love seeing how they turn out, hearing what you cook with them. That is like a really big deal to me. Um, I I fell in love with mushrooms, about 10 years ago, and I never expected to become the mushroom lady. I was literally driving down the road one day and I saw a sign on the side of the road that's like mushroom foraging workshop today. And I went and I did it and spent a couple hours out there. And by the time I got to the end of the workshop, I was just convinced I was going to pick the wrong kind of mushroom and die. But I really, really, really wanted to know them and work with them and understand them and cook with them. And so I spent a few years reading and researching and trying to understand how to grow them and all of that. And when I finally tried, it was just so much easier than anyone was letting on. And it was so much fun. And you'll find that like once you see them grow, it's it's simple enough the way we talked about it today, but once you see them grow, you'll realize just how simple it is. Because for some reason, people tend to mystify it and make it this untouchable thing that we just simply, a normal gardener can't do. But actually, anyone can grow mushrooms. They're such a blast to grow. And for me, it's become, my life's work, and I love it. I love seeing people get into it. There are currently about 14,000 species of mushrooms that have been identified and an estimated 3 to 4 million in existence that haven't been discovered yet. So my big mission is to get people excited about mushrooms, get people working with them, exploring their possibilities, and just seeing the many things that we can do with mushrooms on this planet. So anyway, thank you for being here. If you would like to join me for the fireside chats, again, our first one is going to be on January 1st. We're going to be talking about restoring the planet's ecosystem, along with a lot of the really cool things that are coming up for this coming year, just in the world of mushrooms, some of the interesting research that's happening and what we're excited about. So we're going to be doing that. And then the following sessions of those are just going to be more talking about different techniques, different discoveries, and different things in mushrooms. So if you're excited about mushrooms and you just think they're awesome, that's not like a paid experience. It's just tune in and we're going to talk about mushrooms, and there'll be a Q&A session at the end of each one. So we're always glad to have you. I'll make sure you get a reminder about that. And then I will be sending out an email later with info about like pictures on how to see if if your mushrooms are ready to harvest, and a few different docs and resources and notes that you can use. And yeah, so thank you again for being here. Happy holidays, and wishing all of you a very, very prosperous and wonderful 2025.